The divine scapegoat. In considering why some Europeans committed genocide and massive destruction of nature in the New World, an historical pattern that is by no means over, but continues furiously on a global scale, with corporate tools of destruction now at the forefront of the assault, I initially proposed that the victim-perpetrator bond works in the course of history, as it is known to work in dysfunctional families. We have seen that the Redeemer complex, the dynamic core of salvationist belief, asserts the redemptive value of suffering in such a way that it legitimates and even sanctifies suffering. On top of all that, the victim-perpetrator bond makes suffering extremely contagious. The invaders of the New World were descendants of indigenous peoples whose way of life had been destroyed by carriers of the Palestinian Redeemer complex, as if by a biological plague. Infected by the same virus, they in turn, some of them at least, destroyed the way of life of the indigenous people of the Americas. Like the Christians who converted their distant ancestors to the Redeemer complex, the invaders believed in a God who could redeem sin, and this belief permitted them to commit sin, to inflict suffering in his cause, and even to feel sanctimonious about it. Spanish mercenaries burned the natives of Central America by 13s, quote, in honor of our Redeemer and the 12 apostles, Bartholomew de las Casas reported. So this is the main professor reading from chapter 18 of Not in His Image. With that opening passage, I will present the entire chapter as a sort of prelude to comments that I want to make for Dakini Weather Watch number 6, which is titled Azazel and Arman. By the way, you may note as I continue, if some of you would care to follow the text that I'm reading or eventually consult with it, that I've modified the language slightly. For instance, in the first sentence I say, in considering why some Europeans committed genocide. Certainly in the next revision of Not in His Image, I would add that word and I would place it in italics for emphasis. It was not by any means all the European colonialists and settlers who came to the New World who committed genocide upon the native peoples of the Americas. Certainly not. Therefore, the Europeans cannot be blamed or scapegoated in the manner of a blanket policy for what happened to the Native Americans. Certainly, white settlers and colonialists in some numbers were responsible for a massive program of genocide and territorial aggression, no question about it. But equally so, and I believe I've made this point elsewhere, the stories of mutual aid, cooperation, reconciliation, and acts of kindness and compassion shown by the natives of the Americas to the settlers and vice versa were, in my mind, certainly far more numerous. If you're counting the numbers of people involved, they were far more numerous. The record of history does not normally record these benevolent deeds. It does not normally make a big deal out of the transactions of kindness and mutual aid that certainly occurred over many generations. The point that has to be borne in mind before I continue to pick up reading this chapter is that those among the European colonialists and settlers who did perpetrate these deeds were in a position to do so because they were operating from a certain power structure, a governmental religious power structure that they brought with them. And that power structure itself was the product of the Redeemer complex and the salvationist belief system. So it must be said, to set the record straight, that some colonialists were in a position of power, military power and otherwise, that allowed them to commit and perpetrate these crimes. They served the system to which they belonged. They were instruments of that system. So to that extent, my primary thesis holds up very well. Some of you may know that in the introduction to Not in His Image, I pointed out that I am, to my knowledge, the only historian who has applied the theory of abuse bonding in dysfunctional families to the historical record. Others may have made that observation here and there. I'm sure certain people have. I quote a few people who have made that observation or drawn the parallel, but I develop a comprehensive and straightforward correlation between abuse bonding and the perpetration of abuse and victim-perpetrator bonding in the family to the historical record. And I stand, I think, as an outstanding voice in that respect. And I'm quite proud of having undertaken that particular task when I wrote Not in His Image. So to continue, I will read more or less verbatim from the text, and again, with possible slight modifications and corrections that come to my mind over the last 13 or so years since the book came out. So to continue, subheading, the divine victim. The lethal insanity of the victim-perpetrator bond is staggering. The complicity of victims and perpetrators is a gruesome pact, but there is still a deeper dimension to this horror. Discussing the question of what, quote, makes God accessory to the manifest sinfulness of the human world, Alan Watts observed, quote, beyond this theological nightmare, there is the fascination of supernal masochism, end quote. The factor of supernal masochism comes to expression in what can be called victim-perpetrator collusion. The two parties are not merely complicit in their beliefs, they are intricately and intimately codependent in their actions. Victims and perpetrators need each other desperately and use each other both viciously and vicariously to keep their bond intact. This is not true of first-time out-of-the-blue victims, of course, but of the addicted kind, those who come back for more, glorify the victim role, and blindly follow the same narrative as the perpetrators, convinced that it puts them on higher moral ground than those who harm them, or believing that they are called to suffer for the sake of others. But now a huge objection. If the Redeemer complex is so utterly wrong, so contrary to the essential good nature of humanity, if that may be presumed, how can it be so powerful? For the continuation of this audio, which runs to a 24-minute reading of the chapter, go to the YouTube channel Nemeta. A link is provided in the description.